Okay, first of all, I'm Graham Atherton. I work for the National Aspergillosis Centre. That centre is the reason why we're all here today. The centre opened in 2009. It was launched by the director, Professor David Denning, who unfortunately can't be with us today because he's at a major international scientific conference in Copenhagen this weekend. Just a clash of dates, otherwise he would have been here. And this whole poetry involvement is his initiative. It's his initiative, but it's my job, okay? I run, as part of what I do at the centre, I run the patients' support groups. And one of the things we noticed while running those groups, and we've been running them for about 3 years now, is that, shall we say, the conversations were becoming a bit predictable. Patients and staff had reached a point where we all knew where we were, in your comfort zone sort of thing. And David's idea, Prof's idea, was to try and take people a little bit out of the comfort zone and start to get people integrating. And one of his ways of doing that was to introduce the creative arts into what we do. We ran a competition last year, which was based in schools, of which we got about 400 entries of pictures and pieces of art, which was a fantastic response. That was just for the northwest of England. This is the second initiative. We've run a couple of patient groups where we've had our poet in residence, Caroline, who is sitting on the front, who you'll meet shortly. And what we found was quite surprising. We found the least likely patients you might think would be interested actually sort of seem to really like the whole process of thinking creatively. We didn't sit them down with a piece of paper and say, write a poem. We did it, or Caroline did it a lot better than that, a lot more simply. And we found that people were suddenly energized by this. And we thought, well, that's quite remarkable. But possibly even more remarkable was the effect it had on staff. Several nurses started off thinking, why are we spending money on this? By the end of an hour, we're deeply in with the group conversations and they were loving every minute of it. So the power of what we're doing with poetry is really quite profound with staff and with patients and the interaction between the two. So, I've already talked too much about that. So, first, National Aspergillosis Centre, what is Aspergillus? What is aspergillosis? I'll just go over it a little bit, very quickly. Aspergillosis is an infection mainly of the lungs and the sinuses. It's generally incurable. It's a very, very debilitating disease for someone who has an infection, which is what we mainly treat. There are several different types. Some of them are allergic, some of them are actual invasive, destructive infections of the lungs. We find that those diseases are quite relatively rare and relatively unknown amongst most of the medical profession as well as the public. So one of the functions of this initiative is to increase awareness in both groups. And we are finding that's actually starting to work. If any of you were looking at The Guardian yesterday, there was an article about this very initiative in The Guardian yesterday. But of course, the other part of what we're doing is about helping the patient-staff interaction, okay? So, Aspergillus itself is a fungus. We've got some fungus outside if you want to go and have a look at it later. The fungus can be very beautiful if you look at it down the microscope, but it can be very brutal if you get an infection. Most of us won't get any sort of infection from this, and that's why it remains rare. Some of our research is beginning to suggest that it may be not quite as rare as we think. It might be related to TB, for instance. So that's the kind of work we've been doing. So, I was persuaded by my ecologist colleagues to actually say something positive about fungi. I've told you all about nasty things that it does, and if you go outside you'll see some rather nice pictures of mushrooms and structures that are quite beautiful. There is a positive side to fungi. Fungi are the dustbins of the world. They get rid of all our rubbish. But also there are medically important aspects of fungi. You may or may not be aware that transplants of organs are only possible because of a drug called cyclosporine. And cyclosporine is produced by fungi. It was originally isolated in 1972, and since that time there have been tens of thousands of transplants that are possible only because we have this immune suppressing drug that comes from fungi. That's one good thing. Much more recently, in 2008, cyclosporins have also been found to be very effective in preventing heart damage after you've had an angioplasty. 40% less heart damage, which is something that wasn't predicted originally, but that's an example of something that's happened very recently, which is a positive effect medically of fungi. So fungi have a very positive, a very good side to them. So don't go away thinking they're horrible monsters. They cover both sides. Right, that's about all I have to say. All that's left for me to do is to say thank you to yourselves for coming. Thank you to the Manchester Literature Festival for hosting this event. Thank you for Manchester Museum for allowing us to use these facilities. Most of all, possibly, thank you to the performers who you're about to see. Caroline is the person who's organised this event, who will come up here in a second. But our performers, Rebecca, Denise, Chris and Beth, will be doing most of the hard work, I think. So thank you very much for them for agreeing to hold this event with us. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Graham. As Graham says, my name is Caroline Hawkridge, and it's been my absolute pleasure to be the writer-in-residence at the National Aspergillosis Centre and to learn all about fungi. Until I went there, the only fungal disease I knew about was athlete's foot. Unfortunately, aspergillosis is rather more serious than that. I'd particularly like to thank Professor David Denning as well. I think we could have called this event David's Open Door instead of Open the Windows, because he's been fantastically open-minded about working with the arts, and we owe him a lot. I'd like to thank Manchester Literature Festival and the museum, as Graham has. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge said that poetry is the best words in the best order, and I felt very much when listening to staff and patients at the hospital that that's what they were struggling with, to get the best words in the best order. And Rebecca Goss and Denise Bundred are two poets who I think have been able to do that, and we learnt a lot looking at their poetry about undergoing tests, dealing with diagnosis and treatment, and the receiving and giving of bad news. In 2007, Rebecca's daughter Ella was diagnosed at the hospital where Denise worked as a paediatric cardiologist, but they only actually met later as poets. Since then, Denise has been shortlisted for the Hippocratic Prize for Poetry and Medicine, and Rebecca has been shortlisted for the Forward Prize. Now, if you're new to poetry, I should tell you that this is a £10,000 prize, and there are only 5 poets in the whole country that were shortlisted for the best collection, so it's one hell of a prize, and Rebecca's one hell of a poet. We're really delighted that Rebecca and Denise are reading for us this afternoon, but we're also, we've commissioned some music on the subject of breath, and I couldn't actually think of anybody better to commission than Chris Davies, because Chris was the wind shepherd in France for a project where all sorts of musical instruments were created along the coast so that the wind could be caught and would play them. So the wind, the air that we breathe. But even more amazingly than that, Chris then said, could he work with Beth Allen? And Beth is a creative voice specialist, and she said that voice is at the centre of everything that she does. Indeed, breath is at the centre of everything she does. So rather than keep shaping my own breath to give you more words, I would like to ask you to give a big welcome to all 4 of the performers who will be led by Denise Bundred. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. Synchrony. He mistook a faint in the chair for a doze when he missed the end of the arches. His heart slowed to the pace of his old man's shoes, stuttered like the Ford he no longer drove for bread and the paper. No one heard his heart hibernate like the hedgehog he'd fed in the autumn. I traced an incision below his clavicle, probed parchment skin, dissected a tissue plane, needled the vein. I threaded the lead to his heart, buried the pacemaker below a string of muscle, sewed it into the pouch with silk. His quickening pace warmed his feet, lifted a cloud that misted memory. He thanked me, his palm dry as the Outeniqua yellowwood he'd caressed when he climbed Skeleton Gorge from Kirstenbosch, summer of '75. The partnership linked by a thread is strong as another synchrony his hand remembers, searching cold sheets beside him in the night. 2 years without a faint. He retraces the mound of metal beneath his skin, prays this battery will outlive him. At Christmas time, footballers from the big Liverpool clubs visit children in hospital, and some years ago I was on the ward when the team arrived. Now, children on the cardiac ward were often extremely ill, and this young man, already a famous footballer, stood transfixed. And this was one image I had when I was writing this poem, and the other was of young fathers, often so out of place on the children's ward in this very strange and frightening environment. 18. His rabbit in the headlights face is reflected in a silver bauble on the Christmas tree at the entrance to the children's ward. He smells astringent sharp on his hands, flinches at an alarm strident call, fumbles signed pictures from his tracksuit pocket, watches a teammate pose for photos with father and son whose Christmas has just come early. He hesitates longer than on that first Saturday at 3 o'clock when he emerged from the tunnel at Anfield. He tastes the adrenaline of panic on his tongue. An 18-year-old stands awkward beside his baby's cot, decorated with team strip, red scarf twisting through the bars. The footballer is drawn towards this beacon of the familiar, his name in white letters on the tiny strip, his step propelled by a father willing him down the ward. The infant sleeps uneasy in the crib, sweaty, breathless, blue. The mask blows oxygen gentle across his face. 2 boy men discuss a boot, not a millimeter out of place, the trajectory of a ball in flight, lifted towards the rectangle of a final goal. Part of the work that I did as a cardiologist was to scan babies before they were born, if there was a risk or a suspicion of a heart condition, and then discuss with families what that would mean for a child after birth. Initially, I wrote this poem from the point of view of the parents, and that really didn't work, and was only when my MA tutor said to me, "You really need to write in the voice of the doctor." And it was only after that that I actually started writing poetry. Fetal scan. They're laughing at a private joke. Her blouse glides a pattern of tiny flowers across her rounded belly. He should be at school, not sitting here in holy jeans, stretched brown t-shirt, love bite purple on his neck. I spread cold gel across warm skin. You turn, show me your heart beating beneath my hand. I see the twisted valve, the missing chamber. Your heart the same size as a tiny fist gesturing me away. Leave me alone, don't tell my parents yet. When you breathe after that perilous journey into light, your heart will falter and fail. For a few minutes more, they think you are perfect. You would never have to leave. Thank you.
to follow that. That was lovely, beautiful, thank you. I love the way you were almost talking to each other at the end there. Hello, and yes, I want to echo, pardon the pun, all the everything you've said, Denise, really, all the thank yous to the people, and especially to Caroline for such a well-organised event today. Thank you very much. And it is a real personal, and it was a professional pleasure to read with Denise, but also a real personal one. Briefly, just to talk a bit about her birth, for those who know nothing about it, it is about the birth and death of my first child, Ella. She was diagnosed with severe Ebstein's anomaly shortly after birth, a very rare heart condition. The book is split into 3 sections. The first beginning with Ella's birth and ending with her death. The middle section is about my life without her, and the third section addresses the birth of my second child. So I'll read a few from each section. I'm going to read probably a few more hospital-based medical ones due to the setting and theme of today, and some that I haven't read before, possibly because I thought they were a bit too sad. So I'm just going to picture you all naked and get on with it. What I'll say about this one, my poems are very, very clear. There's nothing complicated about them, but this is about the room in which we were, in which Ella's condition was explained to us. And all I'm going to say about it, the poem explains that whole feeling, but as soon as the door opened and I saw inside the room, I knew Ella was in big trouble. Room in a hospital. No tabloids, no vending cups, no debris of the bored and hungry. Instead, carpet, fireplace, neat, homely items. This is not the room where you wait for news. This is the room where you are told it. At the coffee table, the doctor hunches to draw a heart. It needs time from his pen, crossings out, and a white space where the valve won't meet. The heart is 36 hours old, and hers. Perched on cool leather, we puzzle the sketch. My husband takes his glasses off to cry. Our daughter warrants a new vocabulary, and we are struggling to learn. A few years ago, I read for the child bereavement charity, the Child Bereavement UK, at one of their conferences for NHS staff here in Manchester, actually. And a doctor afterwards came up to me and she said, I know all about that bad news room. But she said, how else can we do it? And I thought, yeah, I know, so I'm not having a go. But yeah, how else can you do it? Talking about that language and vocabulary, Ella's condition did bring with it a lot of words I'd never heard before or had to use before. And it was all about getting my head around them. But this poem is about a particular word that I did know, but I was very reluctant to understand it. Palliative. I knew what it meant, but that didn't stop me. I came home from clinic early in her life, sat on the stairs with my hardback Collins, solid as a baby on my knee, thumbed quickly through papery leaves, whispering LMNOP to seek the word they said once when discussing the flawed mechanics of her heart. There, on a gauzy page, its definition printed across shadows of my fingers, I read, serving to palliate, from Latin, pallium, a cloak, and turned back to find palliate, verb 1, to lessen the severity of pain, disease, etc., without curing. And I reread without curing until curing didn't look like curing anymore. It looked like curling, and I clasped my hands around my knees, pulled that book hard against my gut. As a student, I loved its reams of indisputable fact, its ability to reveal and make clear. Now I bury its bulk on the shelves, swathe myself in hope. A recent review of the book mentioned how early on Ella's death comes in the book, and I hadn't really thought about that and how significant it was, but I guess it is. She was here for a very short time, so the death does come quite quickly in the story that is being told. And I also, my dear old dad, as I was finishing the book, asked me, what's this book about, Rebecca? Which may sound like a crazy question coming from Ella's grandfather, but he was right to ask it. And I actually think Ella's life is in here and is in here. And actually this book is really one about bereavement, I think, really, if I had to sort of categorize it in any way. Severe Epstein's anomaly. The lack of a cure sparked dreams. In one, her father and I set out for the island of disease beating in her body. Her breath in our sails, we navigated waves of excess fluid toward the ruins of her lungs. Gradually propelled to the heave of her heart's edge, I laid my hand on its plump shore. Her father kissed my brow, kit bag swung across his back, and trekked towards the faulty, flapping dam of her tricuspid valve. There, he gazed into the chamber with its swish of redirected river and set about his sole desire to fix her. In intensive care, as she fails in her father's arms, doctors run to swarm her, apply repeated pressure to her chest. We flounder in the doorway, lose sight of her small body, until a man, head bent, his mouth aflood with tender vows, tugs us to her bedside to grant him the undocking and let her come adrift. This poem is trying to sort of explain one of the many, many things I miss about her, but I think one of the things I miss, especially because she was only 16 months when she died, and because she'd been poorly, she never crawled and walked. She may not have done that anyway by 16 months, but I physically held her a lot. So one of the things I really miss is just her mass, her actual mass holding her. And even with a new child in my life, this full-on 3-year-old who's clambering all over me, I miss this mass of small child. Muscovado sugar. I reach for the new kilogram bag, slick with plastic wrap, clutch its bulk in both hands. She weighed the same as 8 of these at the time of her death. The mass her father carried to intensive care, flanked by medics gifting oxygen to her lips, and I walked behind, able to see her crown, her father's competent back, conscious of my arm, of someone's grip. I should scissor this bag open, ease crystal heaps onto scales, but I'm stuck in an imaginary stacking. 8 bags cradled elbow to elbow, her cardinal number stretching across my breast, carried up the stairs to lie down on the bed, pull the covers over us. Imagine her yielding. Imagine her move. When you're when you find yourself in the world of hospitals, and you're having to spend some time there, I do feel that I do believe that you can become sort of institutionalized quite quickly. It is another world that you enter. And there are 2 things to say about that world. One, when I used to go into hospital with Ella, there was part of me that felt a big relief, because the door would close behind me, we were on the ward, and all the real life that was going on out there, like the washing up and the gas bill and walking the dog, that wasn't my problem anymore. I didn't have to think about it. Wasn't my concern. That all had to be done by somebody else. I was in the hospital concentrating on Ella. But then, of course, once you're inside, you also think, shit, I'm back here because she's really, really poorly again. So it was that. And I think that when you are staying in hospital overnight and eating there, sleeping there, washing there, trying to create some kind of normality in order to survive it and get through it, so things become sort of normal. And the one thing I realised that was happening to me, and I discussed with my psychologist at Alderhay at length, is that I started to think it was normal that children got ill. And this is an epiphany I had at some traffic lights after Ella died. The lights. Pausing in traffic, I'm miles away when a file of children forces me to focus. School now behind them, they cross in a bustle of coats and bags, their ages vague to me, but their limbs bold and flailing, affirming themselves with shoves and pushes. I marvel this mass of certainty. Even the loners get to the other side, lights turning green as they dawdle. I'm beginning to realize most children make it. It's rare to see your child being fought for in intensive care, to stay with her afterwards, saying her name. It's unusual at the undertakers to finalize arrangements, then fumble for a photograph so they could know her when she was warm. And the last poem I'm going to read is, well, I thought Denise's last poem was absolutely fabulous, her love poem, and the last poem in the book, I think, is really about me trying to look forward. It's hard. It's very hard. It has been hard for me to just think positively that Molly is going to be all right, because you just keep expecting something bad to happen. So the last poem in the book, I think, is probably my love poem to Molly. Last poem. So extraordinary was your sister's short life. It's hard for me to see a future for you. I know it's there, your horizon of adulthood, reachable across a stretch of ordinary days, yet I can't believe my fortune to have a healthy child with all that waits, the bike, school, mild and curable diseases. So we potter through the weeks, and you relax your simian cling, take exploratory steps, language budding at your lips. I log the daily change, another day lived with every kiss goodnight, wake relieved by your murmurs at dawn. Come and hold my hand, little one. Stand beside me in your small shoes. Let's head for your undiscovered life. Your mother's ready now. Let's run. Thank you very much indeed.
Breath, breathe love until the end. 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 Inhale.